Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, Pauline Hanson running for election again, despite promising to quit politics. Why Paul Hogan is comparing the tax office to the Taliban. And what did Julia Gillard put on the iPod she gave President Obama? Our panel tonight, Craig Reucassel from The Chaser, Chris Berg from the Institute of Public Affairs, and in Canberra, ABC political correspondent Gillian Bradford. Well, Tony Windsor might have stood beside Julia Gillard when she launched her plan for a carbon tax, but it seems 2 weeks really is a long time in Australian politics. The independent MP is now calling for the federal government's strategy a mistake. That's too short on information. He says that's why Australian voters aren't supporting the scheme, and there's no guarantee that he will either.
I think they've put the cart before the horse a bit here. They've sort of given the conclusion without a number, without a target, without a price. And then said that there will be a debate within the community. So I'm not surprised that there's been a bit of a reaction to this.
Mr Windsor has also warned the government against using a taxpayer-funded advertising campaign to sell the carbon tax, calling that a silly idea. Speaking from Washington, the Prime Minister wasn't so sure.
Look, I'm just not going to rule anything in or anything out on government advertising. There is a role for government advertising to get information to people.
Gillian, if Tony Windsor thinks the government has put the cart before the horse and that the strategy is a bad idea, why was he there at the announcing of the strategy 2 weeks ago?
Oh, look, to be fair on that day, remember Tony Windsor did say, and his quote was, "Nothing is settled." So while the Greens were smiling and doing a small victory dance, Tony Windsor was on the effective sideline of that press conference saying, hey, we want to see a lot more detail and nothing is settled. But I think clearly what's changed since then is he would have been surprised about just how ferocious talkback have been, about just how ferocious the feedback has been in his own electorate, and he's not going to go down with the government on this. And I think another element to this is in his own electorate, and of course Tony Windsor has tied himself to a lot of independents. I've heard from one Liberal strategist that Tony Windsor may actually be here trying to shore up the support of the New South Wales independent, currently in an election campaign, and provide some distance between the independents and this carbon tax.
Because there's a crossover between Tony Windsor's seat and that independent around the New England area.
Absolutely, and no love lost between Tony Windsor and the Liberal and Nationals, and he would be doing all he could to try to help that independent.
Craig, are these comments from Tony Windsor about the reaction he's got in his electorate in the last couple of weeks?
Well, it's interesting watching that interview because he certainly seems to claim it wasn't. And Tony Windsor, I think, more so than Oakeshott, who, seems a bit flittish at times. Windsor's quite consistent about it. He doesn't seem to scare too easily to polls, I think. But what was interesting about the interview last night is how many times he mentioned the rest of the world. And that's a real worry for Labor pushing this thing, because if his whole position is I'm only going to do this if the rest of the world's on board, then he would have known that ages ago. He would have known that a long time ago. So him turning up to that press conference already, he must have had a lot of doubts there. So I don't know what it's about. I mean, I think Gillian's right. He wasn't on board at the beginning, so I don't think he's jumping off. But he seems to be a long way from being on board if he's starting to talk about, well, if the rest of the world's not coming with us, then we're not going to do it. I mean, that's a big worry for them.
Chris, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, Craig's absolutely right. Nothing has changed in the debate, so to speak. The difference between Tony Windsor at the press conference and Tony Windsor today, there's no particular difference. There's no policy change. But what he's obviously struck by is the government's dismal failure in that interim period to sell its own policy. But I think it's fair enough to say that he was behind or was supportive of the government's measure. If you're not supportive of a government measure, you don't stand behind them at a press conference. There are a lot of other things you could have been doing.
You don't say you support the process. He said he supported the process.
If he supports the process, and presume he's read the 5-page document or whatever it was they released before he was at the press conference. Now, either he didn't and he's extraordinary, like he's got no sense of due diligence whatsoever to know what he's signing up to, or he has and he's just been so struck by the reaction.
I think his point is that the actual document itself is a lot about we might go this way, we might go this way. His perception still seems to be as part of that Climate Change Commission, and they're still in the process of exploring. And I think he's right from a political perspective as well, that, announcing something without any basis behind it and then making it harder to argue that has been bad for the whole idea, and particularly bad for Gillard.
But now he's turning around and making it tougher for Gillard to do what he what he signed up to support, which is a community process under the terms that he agreed at the press conference.
Gillian, what are the implications for Labor of these comments by Tony Windsor? Is this a little speed bump, or is this more like a roadblock?
Oh, look, I think simultaneously they'd be concerned by what Tony Windsor has to say, but at the same time they'd be far more concerned about how ferociously they are losing the public debate and whether their own side can hold its nerve, because while there's no move against Julia Gillard, there's no rumblings about what's going on despite these absolutely catastrophic news poll figures. 6 months more of this debate, if they can't turn this debate, if they can't start framing the question away from cost of living questions, Labor backbenchers will lose their nerve. They're already saying we're not quite sure why we're doing this. We're not quite sure why we stepped out into the public debate without having the answers. And of course, it's not reflecting in any concern about their leadership at the moment, but 6 months more of being bruised and battered like this will have Labor far more worried about the internal machinations than Tony Windsor. They've still got 6 months to get to a vote.
And Craig, we heard from Julia Gillard at the top of the show saying that she's not ruling out an advertising campaign. How would that go, using taxpayers' money to argue in favour of a new tax?
I certainly think it's crazy to do anything like that when you have no substance. I mean, I think that that would be tough. You know, advertising nothing is hard. It's like
you haven't met enough advertisers.
You can't have a product shot at the end if you have no product, essentially. But I do think that long term, I think if they actually do, it might be the kind of thing where you do need to actually deal with some of the misinformation that's going to be out there. I mean, as Tony Windsor talked about, already a lot of people thinking I'm going to get a tax bill for carbon and all this kind of stuff. I don't think it's the kind of thing. It is a very complex change to the economy. I don't think it's the kind of thing where you shouldn't have information campaigns long term, but you certainly can't have them now.
But Chris, they could be in breach if they do this of the government's own advertising guidelines for governments, which they brought in to combat the Unchain My Heart GST campaign. Exactly.
Every single opposition decides that they're going to make savings, and the way they're going to make savings is by restricting political advertising. Now, oppositions hate political ads because they quite rightly see that the government has a leg up on them. The mistake, or the tactical or strategic mistake that the ALP made when they came into government was actually doing something about it. Now they have to be. Every government has been a hypocrite, or every opposition, every party has been a hypocrite. When they get into government, they go, "Oh yeah, no, we're cutting it down." I'm sure, but the Labor Party made the mistake of actually institutionalising that promise, and now every time they break it, but Gillian, it's a national emergency.
Gillian, they could apply for an exemption under their guidelines, which I think includes a national emergency, extreme urgency, or other compelling reason.
Look, you know what? I think the Liberals would be thrilled if they rolled out advertising at this point for all the reasons that Chris and Craig have just been talking about. The ads will be bad. They will be transparently bad. There's no way. How could you spin this well? And unfortunately, the public is so conditioned now with those Unchain My Heart, with the workplace relations ads that Howard rolled out belatedly, that again just have a cynical public made even more cynical. And I think the professional Liberal advertising team would be thrilled if it's the department and public servants pulling this together, because they would say they'll do a crap job and that'll be great for us.
Chris, interesting piece in The Age today by Sean Carney in which he was arguing that the public has lost the appetite for change, and that any politician who wants to go out there and argue for any kind of reform is really up against it. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do, but I don't think the public has lost the appetite for change, because consistently through all reform movements, regardless of their validity, whether you think they were good reforms or not, the public has been solidly against it. The polling suggested they were against the reforms of the 1980s and 1990s. The polling suggested they were against the GST. There's enough evidence to suggest that you reform against the wishes.
But that was then. What about now?
Well, I think that still holds true. The problem that the Labor government has at the moment, the Julia Gillard's government, is that both the public doesn't have the appetite to reform, and it's a really, really damaged government. It's just not a government that is confident in its own capacity to push through reform. It's already given up a number of reforms a number of times, and it's on such a knife edge.
But I think the fact they've gone back to this shows that they've actually realised that if they go through this term and don't do some real things and get reforms done, there's no chance they're going to get back up. They actually need
Gillard
to achieve
has to have
things.
a win this year.
And Gillard does fight a lot better. And I think the reality is true. Like, I mean, nobody... Remember, it was like the world was going to end. The economic rationalism changes of the 80s and 90s. Not a day went by when an academic or a play school host didn't bring out a book against economic rationalism.
Academics.
Exactly. It was ridiculous. So there was no kind of favour for that at the time. But I think what governments have to recognise is, rather than doing the Rudd way of kind of spinning it out for 2.5 years and then saying, I'm going to do this right before election, you've got to make the change early on in the term and get it so that when people don't realise, oh, the sky isn't falling in, you've got to make the reform early.
Gillian, in that piece in The Age today, it quoted Ken Henry expressing some of his frustrations, the former Treasury head, and apparently he said it's hard to get ministers and leaders engaged in big ideas when they know the public won't have a bar of it.
Yeah, look, that's true, but I noted a lot of Sean's points about this and saying that the public was reform weary, but no government had more political capital on an issue than Kevin Rudd did coming into office on climate change. I mean, I would rank climate change, the feeling around drought and lack of water, as a key issue why John Howard lost the 2007 election. You know, his perceived stubbornness over not moving on climate change was a key factor in that election loss. Kevin Rudd could not have had any more political capital, and I do think the Labor government does have to take it on the chin over the CPRS and its failure to get it through, then dumping it. It's led to the public having no trust in that particular reform, and Julia Gillard's got to find some way of rebuilding it. I don't think it is fair to say that the public has no appetite, because I think you could say the public had a great appetite for reform on this issue back then, and Labor has managed to squander it.
But maybe they have the appetite for reform until they find out what impact it has on their hip pocket. Maybe that's the issue.
Look, and that's true, but I do equally think that such a case had been built for action on climate change by the time Kevin Rudd came into office, that regardless of those hip pocket issues, he had the ascendancy there, and I think it was a failure of his government. And remember, he went something like 7 months without making a major speech on climate change around the CPRS. They dropped the debate, they lost the mandate on the issue, and unlike, what John Howard could say, which is, I'm a conviction politician, you mightn't agree with what I say, but you know what I stand for. You couldn't say that with Kevin Rudd by the end. He didn't prosecute the argument as well as he should have and could have, and a lot of the goodwill from the public dried up over that.
Well, moving on, and in a modern free market